Good evening, everyone. I'm Jim Falk, and thank you so much for joining us. And of course, I want to thank Megan Torrey and Abby Noyes and all of the councils for the support of WorldNow. And just a quick reminder, I have my other screen here, and if you wish to ask a question, and I hope you will, please be sure to add it in the Q&A function and not in the chat area. And there's really a good reason for this because the chat scrolls, and then I can't really keep track of the questions as well as I would like to. And I'll be sure to work in as many questions during the program as I can. It's wonderful to have Larry Wright here. Larry is someone I've known for a number of years, and writing a book at this time about the conflict in the Middle East is, as another great author, Elliot Ackerman, wrote in his New York Times review of the human scale, is gutsy. Whether writing about the Middle East, Scientology, global pandemics, or really the madness of Texas politics, Larry Wright is not only gutsy, he's entertaining, thoughtful, and remarkably accomplished. Now, like I said, I've had the pleasure of knowing Larry for many years because he often came to the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth on his frequent book tours. And also, theatrical productions would be performed in Dallas at the Dallas Museum of Art. And I believe it can be safely assumed that most of you are very familiar with his work. You see, I have a few of his books right over here. Couldn't find the end of October, but I know it's somewhere in our house. And I'm not going to read an extensive biography, but I really do encourage all of you to go to his website, larencewright.com, where you can find links to his extensive body of work. But here are a few highlights. Larry is a staff writer at The New Yorker, a playwright, a screenwriter, the author of 11 books of nonfiction, including The Looming Tower, which was awarded a Pulitzer. The Human Scale is his fourth novel. And if you're determined to really try to understand the Lone Star State and its mad politics, you should read Mr. Texas or go to the documentary on Max, HBO, for God Save Texas. Larry, I hope you'll pop up on the screen and let's begin our conversation.
You got
There
it.
you
All right,
are.
go ahead.
Excellent. There you
Yeah,
are.
we've succeeded.
Good. Good to see you. And thanks so much for taking time to do this. I know how busy you are.
Well,
You know,
thank
you and I both share a love of the Middle East and experience there. And why don't we start by telling our audience about how you first ended up in Egypt?
you. Well, it's a little embarrassing, and it betrays what a provincial young man I was coming out of Dallas, Texas. But I was a conscientious objector during Vietnam, and I had 2 weeks to find alternative service that lasted for 2 years. It had to be at least 50 miles from home. It had to pay very little, and it had to be nominally in the interest of the United States. And I thought, well, I'll go to New York and go to the United Nations, and they'll give me a job far, far away and pay me very little. So I went to the UN, and they said, well, no, we don't do that. And that flummoxed me. And they said, but there is an American institution abroad across the street. The American University in Cairo had an office at 866 UN Plaza. So
Huh.
I walked across the street, and this was in 1969. I knew that there had been a war in the Middle East, but it wasn't the war that I was concentrating on. Uh, I had no idea, you know, I don't think I even knew what language they spoke in Egypt. I'm telling you, I was really naive. And and I didn't know that we had no diplomatic relations with Egypt at the time, and there were practically no Americans, not even very many Westerners in the country. So I walked in, and 30 minutes later, they said, can you leave tonight? Well, no, I haven't told my parents what I'm doing. My girlfriend's still in Boston. Can you leave tomorrow? Yeah, I can go tomorrow. So the next day I flew into Cairo, landed at midnight, and at 9 o'clock the next morning, I taught my first class. And I was teaching English as a second language for kids whose language ability was not quite good enough. And there were 14 levels of descending ability, and I was teaching 13 and 14. So I my first words as a teacher in the number 14 was, "Does anybody here speak English?" And somebody said, "You do." So that was the glorious beginning of my teaching career and my inaugural experience in the Middle East,
What was your major in college?
English literature.
Yeah.
Um, I
But
went,
you had no experience in teaching English as a foreign language.
oh no, no, not at all. I spoke English. That was it. And they
That's
were
all you
so
need.
hard up. They were so hard up. The president of the university turned out to be a CIA agent, and he was a very appealing, polished individual, uh, and it came out at the time. His name was Christopher Toran, and there was a book called CIA Diary by this guy named Philip Agee, who had been in the CIA and had been in the same class with Christopher Toran and exposed him in the book. And of course, at the university, there was a panic because suddenly, everybody in Egypt knows that this is a CIA operation. And and so they were going to, withdraw him, but the Egyptians said, "Oh, we always knew that." And so he stayed around. He was he was a delightful guy, but it was a strange period in our history with Egypt, at least, because at the time it was basically a Russian military base.
Right.
And, there were lots of Russians there, and there was and the Egyptians really, by and large, hated them. Whereas we had no diplomatic relations at all, and the Egyptians loved us because, we had this kind of mix with the help type of mentality, and, we were always available. And uh, but the Russians were, uh, they didn't want to be there, and they made it really clear.
Yeah. So I think it's fair to say the Middle East got under your skin and you've remained attached to it. When did you become a journalist there?
Well, becoming a journalist was, I never studied journalism. In fact, in most schools, it wasn't offered as a discipline to study
Yeah.
at all. There were school newspapers and that kind of thing, but not a. And I'm not a believer in journalism as a discipline. It's a for schools. It's best thought of as an apprentice type of profession. And when I came back from Egypt, I decided, well, I'll write for the New Yorker. So I,
Aim
sp-
high.
I spent 6 months in this little lake house writing letter from Cairo. And I put it in a brown manila envelope and went out to the little RFD mailbox and raised the red flag and sent it to William Shawn, the editor of the New Yorker. And I know this can't be true, but it seemed like that package went from Quitman, Texas to Manhattan to the desk of William Shawn and back the next day. So with this little rejection slip, and somebody had handwritten sorry on it. So I realized it was going to take me a little longer to become a journalist. But I learned in that experience something about writing, and I had already had in mind, the audience that I wanted to reach. But I went around mainly in the South to newspapers trying to get a job as a journalist, and finally wound up in Nashville, Tennessee, at the Race Relations Reporter. And I was covering the waning days of the civil rights movement. It was a great beginning for me.
I didn't even know there was a title, race relations reporter, until I was looking at that a few days ago, reading your extensive bio. And how did that really help you in this situation in looking at the schism and division in the Middle East?
Well, we have a lot of the race relations full of conflict, and I was once again, I was thrown into a situation I was ill prepared for. I didn't know much about, I mean, I've been out of the country for 2 years. Uh, you know, basically what it changed about the country as far as I could see is that Johnny Carson had white hair. And so it was, but I came back, the country in 1971 was a boil, with, with the late 60s spill over into the 70s, the race riots, the cities burning, and then other, it wasn't just black and white questions, Asians and Indians and, all these different minorities had uh, become alive. And it was a great template to see America change. And I think, I had the privilege of covering uh, maybe the one of the finest things that America ever did to its society, which is open itself up to voices that hadn't been heard. And that process is still ongoing, of course. But it really challenged me as a young man from a young white Catholic, Protestant, from Dallas, to see other people's lives and see that we lived in the same country, but we had different opportunities. Um, and I think that has formed a lot of my outlook, uh, and I think it played into to writing this novel. I have seen people struggle in our own country, so it makes me more understanding of the struggle elsewhere.
And how they may not be able to communicate or work together in their area, but they can elsewhere.
Yeah, well, I guess you're referring to my observation that, the Arabs and the Jews can't live together in the Middle East, but they do fine in Brooklyn.
Right.
It's a conundrum that, but also a hopeful one, I think, that it's possible to get together and live together in harmony.
Now, asking a question of someone who's written a thriller or a novel gets tricky because I don't want to give away the plot. And so I'm sure you have a boilerplate answer to sort of set the stage about the human scale, and then we can continue more with the discussion of the underlying themes.
Well, this novel takes place in Hebron, which is a character essentially in the novel because I've been there a number of times. It's the most hateful place I've ever been, and as a person who covered the race relations in America, watching the violence and the hatred that comes out of that town, and largely in other West Bank cities as well, but Hebron in particular has a reputation of being a spot for extremism. And I I was interested in trying to set a crime in in that environment. Crimes, and are there's a reason why there are a lot of crime novels and detective stories and that sort of thing. A fascinating crime is like it bores a hole into society, and you can see all these underlayers that you don't get to see normally.
Hmm.
And so I decided I would have a crime that would be, in this case, it's the chief of police of the in Hebron, the Israeli police, is murdered, is he's beheaded, and it seems like it might be a Hamas operation, even though Hamas is not known for beheadings. And so his second in command, Yossi Bengal, is a tough guy. He's been in the army for years. He was in the police forces when they were dealing with the intifadas, and he believes very strongly that Israel is the only safe repository for Jews in the world, and he will do whatever he can to protect it. And so he's on a mission to try to solve this crime and punish whoever is responsible. Into town comes a Palestinian American named Tony Malik, who arrives just at the wrong time.
Hmm.
And because he was scheduled to have an appointment with that chief of police who was murdered that very morning, he comes under suspicion. And so Yossi was very disappointed to learn that Malik was actually an FBI agent and really a far better investigator than he.
Right.
And these two men, very similar in some ways. They're solitary, they're smart, they're tough guys, but the tides of history and ethnicity and religion pull them apart. In short, they hate each other, but they have to work together in order to solve this crime. And my goal in writing this, I know this is going to sound naive, but everything anybody says about Israel and Palestine and is naive. You can't help but when you start talking about peace and that sort of thing, you can't help but be labeled naive. But I wanted people to see the situation through the eyes of others. When you stand on one side of this issue, uh, if you can't see the world through the eyes of your antagonist, you're no help. You're not an agent of peace because you refuse to get outside of your own perspective. And the challenge that I present to the reader is there are a lot of different perspectives in this story. Every character has a different piece of the truth, their own truth. And my goal is to help the reader uh, see how these people live with their own perspective, and how would you behave if you were in their place? I think, the question that is most disliked in both sides of this conflict is no one wants to take on the question of how they would be if they were on the other side. And that's what this novel hopes to do.
And also that your characters were likable as they grew and you
Yeah.
learn more about them.
Well, that's part of the subversiveness of of the narration. I want you to like the people and be and unable to resist the truth of their lives.
So one of the things that is so amazing about you, and you do have a crystal ball. Um, Many of
I
the
wish
books
you
that
wouldn't say that. I mean, that's been following me around for a long
I
time.
know,
I
but darn
don't
it,
have a crystal
you
ball.
deserve it. And whether we're talking about the end of October or the siege, but I did not realize until recently how early you had come up with the idea of this book.
Oh,
And that it originally was a screenplay and or a theatrical production. Could you talk more about that?
well, yeah, it seems like all my novels started out as unproduced screenplays. So, but I started writing this decades ago, and the idea was a kind of in the heat of the night. You remember that movie with Sidney Poitier and Rod Steiger? There's a cop in rural Mississippi, and he arrests a black man coming from Philadelphia, and it's a similar setup for this. And I thought, it didn't work as a screenplay. It was partly my fault, but also Hollywood was afraid of it,
Hmm.
and which is still true. But dealing with anything having to do with the Middle East is has a kind of plutonium around it. It just you don't want to get too close to it. But it's exactly those kinds of things that are difficult to talk about that draw me. I think that's when the artist or the journalist can add something to the conversation, especially if people are afraid to say it themselves. So that story was on my mind, couldn't get it sold, sat in my desk for a few years, but I could never get it out of my mind. And I decided I started going back to the Middle East and start do some research and bring that project to life as a novel.
But when did you turn in the original manuscript? And as a follow-up, how did you change it, adapt it to what happened on October 7th?
Well, there were a couple of iterations of that. One is I went back to Hebron in February of 2023. Uh, and I had already written the first draft, and it ended with a war. That's prophecy angle, but it
Mhm.
was
You can't
predictable.
deny it, Larry.
I know, but it was a predictable outcome because it always ends in a war in the Middle East, and so but it wasn't nearly at the scale that that I had encountered. And so I had, I had met a lot of people during that trip in February and had been very informed by it. So I rewrote it before October 7th and then turned it in August. And then October came.
Mm,
And uh, I was faced with a dilemma because I knew, it was such a deep wound in Israeli society. Um, and it would seem like that in some ways I was exploiting the situation. I wanted to explain it, which was different. And but my alternatives were I could write it, set it somewhere in the past. I could set it somewhere in the future, but neither of those was a desirable way of dealing with the fact of October 7th. So I decided that would be the culmination of the book, that everything is leading to that. So I rewrote it again. And
mhm.
now it is a book that is set in the moments before that horrible tragedy and culminates in it. And so in a way, it awarded meaning to the book that I didn't originally have. And I had to stand out. I had to get out of the way and let the story tell itself.
And I felt as I was reading the book and knowing you that it had to be emotionally draining.
It was.
It
It
this in a
was.
way from other books that you've written. Is that
I,
a fair assessment?
oh yeah, it was hard because I don't know. There's every writer knows the story of Dickens weeping when he's killing little Nell, But the but you get caught up in the lives of imaginary characters that have a reality that is not the same as human reality, but a deep emotional, imaginative link uh, to through your apprehension of these characters that are you are creating them, but somehow they are self-creating at the same time. So you get to know them, and you come to love them. You invest them with a certain amount of passion, and so after after the October attack, I realized that I was going to have to sacrifice more than I had before in terms of my characters, and it was a hard thing, to in, pour increasing amounts of love into characters whose tragedy awaits them.
And I almost wanted a focus group where I could have picked ending A or ending B. It might have made me happier at the end.
Well,
You
some of my characters survived the first draft and didn't the second. So,
you've just touched on this, and well, first let me remind everyone. I see a few questions, and please keep sending them in, and we'll work them in a few minutes. Um, the characters, some of the people you probably knew, others you made up totally.
right.
Give us a sense about that, and I want you to talk, if you would, about Issa Amro, because I was not aware of his work.
Uh, I everybody in the all the characters in the novel are uh, based in some way on personalities I've encountered. Some are more conglomerations than others, and I've spent time with Mossad agents and Shin Bet, and the intelligence agents are closely they rely a lot on what I learned from them. Uh, I met with the Palestinian policemen. There's a scene in Paris with this professor at Sciences Po who resembles a friend of mine. I taught his class one time, and through life, I've spent a lot of time getting to know people, and in other walks of life, and bits of them stay with me. And weirdly enough, they are all in a palette or a workshop. I'm not sure what the right metaphor is. So that when I'm writing, I can call back those experiences and sometimes the actual conversations that I had. And Issa is a good example. I met him when I went that February. Uh, and I was trying to deepen the story, and he was very helpful to me in that regard because uh, he is, as far as I could tell, the only peacenik in Hebron. He reminded me so much of the people during the civil rights movement who, like the people who, the freedom riders and the people who sat in at the diners, and they knew they were going to be beaten, and they were willing to do that. And Isa is of that tribe. He is one of those people who is deeply hated by the Israeli soldiers because he challenges them and he knows the rules, and he represents a real threat to the settlers in Hebron and elsewhere because he calls attention to the problems. Um,
And you were with him when he was
all right in front of me. Yeah, yeah, this never happened.
assaulted.
Uh, I He was showing me the old city and his house that had long been shut down by the IDF, and we were walking with this Belgian photographer, Barbara, and there's a place, um, Al-Shahada Street was the main market street when I was many years ago in 1997. I was in Hebron and I was walking down that street, and school had just gotten out for these uh, Palestinian, they look like junior high school girls in their little school uniforms. And there was a Israeli settlement on that street, and there were these settler kids who were throwing rocks at the schoolgirls, and one of them threw a rock at me, and I was really pissed off. I had a pretty good arm at that time, and I thought, "Watch out, kid!" And but there was this Israeli soldier up on the rooftop with his M16 who was protecting the settler kids so that they wouldn't be harmed as they hurled these rocks at these little girls.
Mm.
And that image stayed with me. And so years later, I'm walking through that down that same street. Isa is not allowed to walk on portions of that street because he's a Muslim, because he's Palestinian. So there was a cemetery that paralleled the street, which was almost entirely empty now. All the shops had been closed. It had once been this, long bazaar, but it was, totally empty except for this one Israeli soldier who was seated at a card table, and he, Barbara and I passed by, and he asked for our identity, and then we walked on, and then he caught up with us, and Isa came down from the cemetery into a portion where he was allowed to walk, and the soldier began to harass him. It was unprovoked. And, Isa had done nothing except to say, the soldier wanted Barbara to delete a picture she had taken of him.
Mm.
And Isa said, she has a perfect right to do this. And so the soldier grabbed him around by the scarf of his collar and dragged him over to a chair or to a bench. And it was in front of the barracks where a lot of the soldiers were stationed. And they came out and they started watching. And Barbara was filming, and I was talking to some of the soldiers saying, I'm worried about this guy. He's being very aggressive. This is going south really quickly. And at one point, the soldier picked Nisa up by the neck and hurled him onto the ground, his head missing a curb by like an inch. And then he wound up and kicked him so hard he almost fell down. At that
Mm.
point, somebody began to kind of steer him away, but it looked to me like he was circling. He wanted to finish the job. What struck me so strongly, he saw us watching. We were witnesses. He saw Barbara taking videos. He didn't care. He was so emboldened and so full of anger and hatred uh, toward Isa, who had done nothing to provoke him. Um, it was I posted the videos that Barbara had taken, and then the IDF had said that he had been provoked, and I refuted that, and they called me in and asked uh, to talk about it, and um, the point they wanted to make to me is this is not who we are. But there are too many examples of this kind of behavior.
Larry, is this a good time for you to read from page 336?
Oh, I'll be happy to.
Because we talk about hatred and grief there, or you do.
Yeah, this is an exchange. Yossi Bengal has a very appealing daughter, Sarah, and this comes to Malik's attention. So, and it happens that Yossi is celebrating an Israeli holiday, but he celebrates all Israeli holidays as Purim, and so he's passed out on the patio, and that gives Malik and Sarah a chance to get to know each other, and the and and they reveal things about each other in a very intimate way. Um, so Malik says, happiness seems to be the one emotion completely lacking in this place. And Sarah replies, oh, it's so true, but nobody ever admits it. They're too passionate to be happy. Happy is not big enough, not like hatred. I suppose you've noticed that this is the world capital of hatred. Everybody hates something, somebody. What do you hate? I hate the hatred. Honestly, I can't stand it. Every other emotion gets squeezed out. Do you know why? Because there's an even bigger emotion inside all of us, on both sides, Jews and Arabs, an emotion we're all afraid to express. She was quiet, as if the answer was charged with some kind of power she was reluctant to release. Finally, she spoke, her voice thick with emotion. Grief. Israel was created by a grieving people. If we had dealt with that, if we had accepted our suffering, we might have found happiness, if such a thing exists for a nation. But we let our grief define us. All this rage, this depression, shame, this insistence on revenge, they are all expressions of a grief that is too big for us, too big for any people. And then we made Palestinians in our image, a grieving and dispossessed people. She looked apologetically at Malik. I shouldn't speak for you. Is that how you feel as a Palestinian? Malik took another sip of wine. The conversation was taking him into deeper water than he had expected, and his head was already clouded by drink. The longer I'm in Palestine, the more American I feel. But something has changed. It's deep. I'm getting acquainted with where I came from, or at least a part of me, the Palestinian have. I can see what I lost, the connection with my roots, but I haven't been able to. He hesitated, but he felt propelled to explain something he didn't fully understand. I spent months interviewing members of ISIS at an American base in Syria. My Arabic wasn't perfect, but there weren't that many of us in the Bureau who spoke it at all. Our assignment was to find out what made these guys become terrorists. A lot of them were well educated. They had a grudge against America, and I understood that. They all said Islam was under attack, even though they were the ones attacking Muslims. With Al-Qaeda, the big premise was that you'd be rewarded with virgins in paradise, but with ISIS, you didn't have to wait. Just sign up and they'll issue you a sex slave. This was a huge motivator for a lot of lonely young men. There was this Iraqi kid. We called him Howdy because he had big eyes and red cheeks, and he reminded some of the old guys of Howdy Doody, this television show they watched when they were children. Howdy was 12 when I talked to him. Friendly, smart. His parents took him to Syria when he was 9 to liberate Muslims, they told him. He became a part of their youth group, Cubs of the Caliphate. I saw a video of this same child assassinating ISIS captives. They were lined up on their knees, blindfolded, and he walked behind them with a handgun and shot them each in the head, 11 of them, one after another. He never hesitated, an absolute stone cold killer. Howdy was fixed on the fact that I was Palestinian. He couldn't understand how I could also be American. He told me, we're doing this for you. For Palestine, he meant. And I thought, is that what Palestine really is? An excuse to turn children into barbarians?
Mm. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's one of the reasons you want to read this entire book. We have a question from one of our viewers. You mentioned that anything about the Middle East is like plutonium, that people don't want to touch it. Have you ever faced negative repercussions from the public or people you knew regarding any of your writing, your journalism or books? I know the answer to that. How did you respond, and what advice do you have for people who write about controversial topics, especially considering the current political climate's threat to free speech in the United States now?
Oh, I guess the reason you're laughing, you're probably thinking of my book on Scientology.
Indeed, exactly.
But that was, first of all, let me say there was a lot of plutonium around that story. But it was because they were so scary and they had all this, the threats of lawsuits and a history of really bad things that they did to people who were reporters, that wanted to know more. Is because of that this story was still available to me, and I love that story. It was a wonderful opportunity as an investigative journalist to go deep into something really strange and fun and with an exotic history and with fascinating people involved in it. So yes, they assigned a private investigator to follow me around, which is kind of pointless because I don't go out much. And when I make a speech in another city, he'd be there. I'm in a band. He came to some of my gigs, which I was happy to have him there. But to be intimidated, you have to kind of consent to that. And it just to me was kind of amusing. But on the other hand, a lot of the sources that I talked to were terribly harassed. They had a lot of courage when they knew what they were signing up for when they agreed to talk to me. And I regret that so many of them had to uh, suffer these kinds of privacy intrusions and threats and lawsuits and things like that. I I went through, it started as a New Yorker story, then it became a book, and then it became a documentary. And at no point did they ever actually sue, despite innumerable threats.
And what advice would you give someone in college now about tackling controversial subjects on either side of this issue?
Well, you have to be willing to put yourself out there. And it is uncomfortable sometimes. And I used to be a lot more sensitive to people who didn't agree with me. But there is and I would be if I made a terrible mistake. If I made a terrible mistake and slandered somebody or, I would feel awful. But to have someone disagree with me is no longer the worst thing that ever happened to me. I expect that people won't agree with some of the things that I write or say. And it, it comes with it. But on the other hand, if people are, let's just say reporters are afraid to speak up and reveal this truth as they see it, then we're headed towards a catechism politically.
The dynamics in Gaza have changed dramatically in the last 48 hours, I would suggest, from what's happening as far as Israel going public now and saying that they're probably going to occupy the Gaza Strip. The question is, what role do regional dynamics play in the conflict? And the U.S. has always been a significant presence. What role does the United States have now, can have?
Those are really important questions. And, it's Gaza and the Palestinian cause in general has, had um, difficult, support from difficult countries like Iran. Iran has been a bad actor and has supplied a lot of the missiles and armaments that Hamas has been using. And but on the other hand, when I think about why uh, October 7th happened on that date or around that time, it was because of Israel and Saudi Arabia were forging an agreement that would, uh, settle affairs between the two countries without really bothering very much with the Palestinians. It was pretty clear that the Arab world was tired of the Palestinian problem and was wanting to move on with Israel. And October 7th was not so fast. And it's yes, it might have happened at any time, but I think that was the trigger.
I think back to the World Cup, where Morocco was playing in, I guess it was the semifinals, and instead of seeing the Moroccan flag in these stands, there were more flags, the Palestinian flag.
Yeah.
And I guess that you could say that's showing really the perspective of the Arab street. And when you look at the Abraham Accords, how are we going to reconcile all this?
Well, I don't know how, but I know that it's not going to be reconciled militarily. Um, it through a coincidence of my parents, I'm the same age as Israel, and a few months older maybe, and it's a young country, Jim.
Yeah,
But the this conflict's been going on my entire life.
yeah.
And and this is let's say during the span of my life, we had the end of apartheid, the end of the Soviet Union, election of the first black man to the presidency. We had the Vietnam War, the Iraq One War, the Iraq Two War, Afghanistan. All of these in history now. We've stepped beyond that, but this conflict goes on and on. So, what makes it so durable? That's the and in my long-term perspective, uh, it's all one war. It's separated by what William James called the peace interval, just time to rearm and get your balance again, and then the war comes again. It's been like that for 77 years, and I there are I wrote this to try to understand what made the this war so durable, and also question how can it be resolved.
We have an Emil Neckley. I know you well, and I see this in the chat. Unfortunately, I saw it. Emil is a professor at the University of New Mexico. Congratulations on this phenomenal novel. He writes, Larry, and he said, does the human scale offer another view of the rise of radicalism that is not necessarily unique to Islam?
Yeah, I don't think that is. I mean, the reaction to occupation is, predictable. It's not. It's not an Islamic reaction. It is a reaction of people who are driven out of their homes, and it's you can argue one side or the other about uh, is this a colonial situation or not? That's one of the subjects that I deal with in this. But it is inarguable that they're occupied, and people don't like to be occupied. Our own country is an example of that.
So we have a question from Rajasi. And what about the Middle East in particular compels you to write about it and study it? You've touched on that, but let me add, is there another story about the Middle East that you want to write?
Oh, okay. I guess, since those early days in Cairo, I've been drawn into the drama of the Middle East. And because I guess because I love my students so much, I felt deeply saddened because they were trapped. I often feel this way when I'm leaving one of those countries that are run by tyrants, and the opportunities is one of the. I use a line that a Muslim Jordanian woman gave to me years ago in a conversation. How long must the Arab world be a cemetery for youth and talent?
Hmm.
And I thought, yeah, that's exactly right. Whenever I get on the airplane, I had that American passport that got me out of there. But, I'd leave behind so many people who were trapped in one way or another in a situation where there was no escape. And I guess partly I allowed myself to be uh, drawn emotionally into the conflict.
Hmm.
I don't try to weigh down, I try to balance my views without being, whataboutist, but to to have compassion for both sides because I genuinely do feel that way.
You've talked about the need for a diplomatic solution. Do you see any leadership on the Palestinian side that gives you any sense of or reason for optimism?
Well, I would say for both sides, I have no faith in either the leadership on either side.
Mhm.
And and the main I wrote a play and then a book that is, yes, you've got displayed up there, the 13 days in
Yeah.
September. And um, the Jimmy Carter, a one-term Georgia governor, uh, incidentally, his first day in office, Walter Mondale told me he was his vice president. Carter walks into the vice president's office and says, "My highest priority in my presidency is peace in the Middle East." And, well, no, that's why we're
Let's do healthcare.
yeah, exactly. So, uh, but anyway, Jimmy Carter is president, and he invites Anwar Sadat, an assassin, and Menachem Begin, a terrorist, to spend what he thought was going to be 3 days in Camp David, and they were going to come up with a peace plan. It took 13 days,
Yeah.
and with this very unlikely cast of characters, they did come up with a peace plan that has not been violated a whit since they signed the papers in 1979. So I believe that peace is possible, but I don't believe that the current leadership is capable of or interested in leading to peace. And that um, and I shouldn't say this because I can't totally support it, but I have come to believe that maybe they're not capable of making peace on their own. And maybe the world has to lead the way through more forceful diplomacy and vast incentives to come up with a peace plan that would be fair to both sides. I
Can you,
acknowledge immediately that that's a naive perspective, as all of them are, but I don't see another out for this region.
and it's hard to see who would be the honest broker now.
It's true. It's true. But to declare something impossible is just a way of cowardly sneaking off the stage and saying it can't be done. It has been done in the past. It can be done again.
What has been the response to your book in the Jewish community in the United States, the Palestinian community, as well as overseas? You did get a wonderful review in the Jerusalem Post. I saw that, but what
Uh,
has been other reactions?
well, that's the only review we've had from Israel. So far is 100% positive. uh, I, I, I worried that I would get a lot more pushback than I have. I think uh, maybe maybe there's just been a hunger for people to see a larger perspective uh, through and unthreatened because this is a novel. It allows you to react emotionally without it having real world consequences, and so maybe that's what is is allowing people that I worried about in terms of their response to be so favorable.
Can you speak for a moment about the title and then maybe read a bit from page 184?
Sure. I did a one-man show in New York off Broadway and in Tel Aviv at the Camry Theater, and it was called The Human Scale. And the what I had done a New Yorker story about Gilad Shalit, and he was this young IDF soldier who was kidnapped by Hamas and held for 5 years, finally exchanged for 1,000 Palestinian prisoners. And so the question that prompted the one-man show, and also that I've used for the title of this book, is how does one life get to equal 1,000? That disparity in the value of human life has to be at the bottom of the conflict because if some lives are so under appreciated and some are so overvalued, then clearly it's not an even meeting. And so, what page was it that you were going to
I think, oh, no, it was 184. Uh,
184?
let me see where it was. 184.
184.
Who can say what is the value of human life? Or you may want to start.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, this is Sarah again. She's writing a paper and it happens to be called The Human Scale. So,
Wonder why.
and so she writes, "Who could say what is the value of of one human life?" Sarah concluded, "Perhaps only God." The scale that weighs the value of human lives goes back to the idea that there is a God who judges some as dear and others as worthless. The God who demands of Muslims that they eliminate Jews before Judgment Day. The God who tells Jews that he has given them land that belongs to others. The God who chooses one people over another. Sarah quoted a biblical story of a Canaanite army that took some Israelite soldiers hostage. Israel made a vow to the Lord, if you will deliver the Canaanites into our hands, we will totally destroy their cities. The Lord heard Israel's plea and handed the Canaanites over to them. The Israelites completely annihilated the Canaanites and destroyed their towns. So the place was named Hormah. The word means devoted to destruction.
No, and Sarah was such an intriguing character as you watched her
I
evolve.
loved her. I gotta say, I was,
Yeah, we can't tell what happens, but
I know, but it's funny when you create a character that is meant to be a romantic partner, it obviously some juice comes out of the author, towards that, and I got very fixed on Sarah.
well, there must be photos of Sarah somewhere in your files.
You're
Uh,
not allowed.
Larry, was with your knowledge and experience in the Middle East, do you think there was a point in time when a decision might have been made that could have resulted in a different situation?
Oh, sure. There's been several, but the one that would be most pertinent, I suppose, is in 1948 when in 47, 48 when Israel is created and then the war takes place.
Hmm.
Uh, the Palestinians, 600,000 of them, uh, either voluntarily left with the intention of returning or were driven out. If we could go back to that moment and have Israel allow them home again, then the world would be different. I know there are downsides to it from Israel's point of view, but that is to me the moment where everything since then has gone back to that moment. Uh, and the dispersal of the Palestinians led to the creation of modern terrorism and not just remember all the hijackings and stuff like that in the 70s, but the and then bin Laden often cited the oppression of the Palestinians as a reason for Al-Qaeda. So the point is it doesn't stay in that region. It spills over into our universities, into our politics, this is an American problem. It's not something that we have set aside and given it to the Palestinians and the Israelis to resolve. Our own politics and our own universities, our streets are full of protesters. This is something that is deeply woven into American society now.
I better be sure to ask this question, or I know I'll get a text from this person. We'll take a break from Middle East just for a second.
Yeah.
Larry, is Texas going to be all right? Native Texan who left the state.
Well, Texas is never all right. It's always stirring up something, and you know, I love my state, and I despair at its politics, but there it like it or not, Texas is going to be the size of New York and California combined by 2050. That's just not very long away. And already you can see each of those states lost uh, electoral votes and they came to Texas. Well, if you think Texas is important in our politics now, um, it's going to be decisive, totally decisive in just a couple of decades. And so, if she wants to avoid that, come home. You're going to be able to make a change.
Get involved.
Yeah.
What are you working on now? Can you tell us?
Oh, yeah. This is a story that's very dear to me. It's about the 7 women on death row in Texas, and this Catholic deacon named Ronnie Elastovica, who's a cattleman, had the women's prisons in Gatesville as part of his ministry, and he he been ministering to the women on death row, and he said they were like feral cats. They're sentenced to die, but the sentence they're serving is they have to live with each other, and he thought, there's some women who live very similar lives. So he drove over to Waco to this convent, and we have Sisters of Mary Morningstar, a new Catholic order, and said, "Sisters, there's some women I think you can help. They're trying to live in community, but they don't know how. And you've got this vast monastic tradition. And oh, well, where are they? Well, they're on death row. Oh, we don't get out much, But but I have to say, these nuns are adorable.
So is
And
this going to be a novel or nonfiction? I
oh,
read
it's
the
not.
piece in the
I
New
started.
Yorker.
I published a portion of it in the New Yorker's 100th anniversary issue
Yeah, I
in
read that.
March, and I'm turning it into a nonfiction book. There's so much uh, there's so much revelation in these stories, and I think comparing the nuns and the women on death row and the lives they led is reveals so much about human nature and about women. I have to say, in my experience, I've just been totally caught up in this story, and I'll probably finish it before the end of the summer. But um, anyway, it's been one of my very favorite stories ever.
Well, one of the things that I enjoyed so much about the book is it was a refresher on the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And we mentioned the review in the Jerusalem Post, and I'll read it. The Human Scale is a superb contemporary political thriller that goes well beyond simply keeping the reader enthralled with a succession of unexpected developments. It continues. Wright provides his readers with real insight in the human dimensions of one of the world's most enduring conflicts. And you really did achieve, I think, what you wanted to do. Is it a challenge to, or how do you approach, because this really isn't historical fiction, but it is history. How do you define what this book is?
Well, my publisher wants to say it's a thriller, it's a detective story, it's really exciting. You'll be turning the pages, and I've done my and that was I wanted to entertain the reader and provoke the reader, but I also had a lot to get off my chest.
Yeah.
And it's been very frustrating to me for as a person who is deeply involved in the lives of people in that region. It's to see it just continue going on and on. And I thought if I can if I can make a book that with characters that really call to the reader and also present a version of history that will help the reader understand why each of these characters is the way they are. Where are they coming from historically? Then that's the purpose of this. I want people to be entertained by it. People, the reviews have said they were entertained, but there was also an agenda at work, and this is my attempt to settle the score with the Middle East as far as I'm concerned.
And I hate to use the word side, but however you look at the Middle East, I think reading the human scale creates for the reader, real empathy. So you've succeeded.
Well,
Larry,
thank
as always, great to see you. Thanks so much for being with us
It's
and
my pleasure. Thanks for having
continued continued success.
me.
And to all of you, thank you so much for watching our program, and we'll see you on the next World Now. Have a great evening.